Zeno didn't plan on becoming a philosopher. He planned on living the life he had built, a life of commerce, identity, and direction. But then the sea took it. A shipwreck off the coast didn't just sink his cargo. It stripped him of everything. What most would call ruin, he later called fortune, because that wreckage forced him inward. That loss carved out the silence where his real life began. For many men, the story isn't all that different. We don't wake up searching for wisdom. We wake up surrounded by ashes, divorce papers, estranged children, a look in the mirror that no longer reflects who we were. Rock bottom isn't poetic. It's quiet. It's shame wrapped in routine. It's existing without presence. It's walking through life with the feeling that somewhere along the way, you disappeared. Men today don't wear armor made of metal. They wear silence. It's the invisible shield strapped to their back every day. It hides everything: resentment, guilt, exhaustion. But unlike real armor, this one doesn't protect. It traps. It keeps the world from seeing how deeply you've been hit. And worse, it keeps you from seeing it too. We've been trained to endure, to tolerate, to swallow whole whatever comes our way. Not because we're fearless, but because there's no space where it feels safe to fall apart. So we shrink into the corners of our own lives, convincing ourselves that this is strength. But silence without understanding is not stoicism. It's slow suffocation. Seneca understood this. Living under Nero, one of the most volatile rulers in history, he didn't rise in rebellion. He didn't beg. He didn't run. He wrote. He reflected. He remained. Not because he didn't feel rage, not because he was numb, but because he chose clarity over chaos. His rebellion wasn't against the emperor. It was against the part of himself that wanted to break. That's the war most men never speak of. The war not against the world, but against collapse. The quiet rebellion of keeping your soul intact when everything else tries to scatter it. This video isn't about external battles. It's not about confrontation or domination or proving anything to anyone else. It's about the 10 battles that happen silently, internally, within the soul of every man who's ever felt himself disappearing. These aren't the kinds of wars that leave bruises. They leave memories. They leave regrets. They leave you lying awake at night asking questions you no longer say out loud. But here's the truth. The man who wins these invisible battles doesn't need applause. He doesn't need to explain. Because he walks through life with a fire that burns clean. A fire that does not consume him, but keeps him from going cold. Each of these battles reveals not what you need to become, but what you need to remember. Who you were before the bending, before the performing, before the silence turned into self-erasure. And no, you won't win them all today. Some of them you've been fighting for decades. But the fact that you're still here, still breathing, still watching, still listening, that means something. That means there's something left in you that refuses to die quietly. So if you're tired of shouting in a world that doesn't hear you, then don't shout. Sit, listen, because this isn't about being louder. It's about being real, being whole, being still. These 10 battles are the ones that matter, not because they make you a hero, but because they bring you back to yourself. And that is a war worth fighting. There's a certain kind of pain that never makes a sound. It doesn't scream. It doesn't break things. It doesn't demand to be acknowledged. It just sits inside a man's chest, like unfinished business. That's the weight of unseen resentment, the kind that grows not from what was done to you, but from what was never asked, from being hurt in ways that were invisible to everyone else. She never asked how you felt, never noticed how much you changed to keep the peace. You stopped bringing things up because you already knew the answer. Silence, or worse, dismissal. So you held it, all of it. You held her anger. You held the guilt. You held the constant adjusting until one day, you stopped recognizing the man you had become. Resentment doesn't start loud. It starts with one small betrayal that goes unspoken, then another, and another, until eventually, you're not even sure if you're angry anymore, or just numb. And here's the thing most men don't admit. When that pain has nowhere to go, it turns inward. What began as quiet frustration becomes self-disgust. You lose patience with yourself. You become overly controlling in other parts of your life. You start demanding order, not because you need control, but because you've lost the feeling of being respected. You start punishing yourself for what others never saw. But this isn't what Stoicism asks of you. It doesn't ask you to pretend you don't bleed. Zeno didn't avoid pain. He redirected it. He didn't drown in the fire. He repurposed it. Stoicism isn't suppression. It's precision. It's the discipline of feeling deeply without being devoured. The man who wins this battle doesn't suppress his resentment. He transforms it, and he does that by doing the one thing most men were never taught. He begins to name it, not out loud, not to her, but to himself. There's a reason why men who journal aren't weak. They're warriors of their own mind. Because when you write something down, you take the shame out of it. You extract the venom. You stop carrying what was never yours to hold. You stop repeating the same wound in silence. You don't write to fix the past. You write so it stops owning your future. So ask yourself quietly, what pain have I been carrying that no one ever saw? What words have been burning in my throat for years unspoken? This isn't about her. It's about the part of you that's ready to stop bleeding internally, the part of you that's tired of being invisible, even to yourself. The battle of unseen resentment is never won through confrontation. It's won through clarity, through giving yourself the dignity of being witnessed, even if only by your own hand. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is finally look at what he's been trying not to feel and let it go. Some battles are fought not with fists, but with silence, with nods, with quiet agreements that cost more than they appear. The battle of over-accommodation begins like that. Small, subtle. You compromise once, then again, not because you're weak, but because you believed peace was worth it. You believed love meant adjusting. So you bent, you softened, you made space for her moods, her needs, her patterns, but no one made space for you. Every time you adjusted, you erased a part of yourself. And the worst part, you convinced yourself this was maturity, that real men don't complain, that strength is measured by how much you can take without breaking. But what if the breaking isn't loud? What if it looks like losing your identity in the name of harmony? What if the man in the mirror doesn't look angry, but empty? Over-accommodation isn't kindness. It's emotional erosion. It's a slow death by self-abandonment. A man who constantly shrinks to keep the peace is not at peace. He's disappearing. And it's not just relational. This response has roots, deep ones. It's what psychology calls fawning. When survival taught you to please rather than protect. When love was something you earned by disappearing a little more each day. Culture doesn't help. You were raised to be dependable, to be steady, to endure. But no one told you that endurance without boundaries is self-erasure. That tolerance without self-respect becomes a prison. Men like you aren't unloving. You're unloved in the way that respects your limits. And without those limits, you begin to forget where you end and others begin. Stoicism reclaims that line. It teaches that boundaries aren't walls. They're instructions, not for others, but for yourself. They're the quiet commitments you make to your dignity, to your soul. A man without boundaries isn't noble, he's lost. And a man who's lost within himself can never truly be present for others. So step back and ask, what have I allowed lately that violates my values? What have I said yes to that felt like betrayal in my chest? This battle isn't about confrontation, it's about recovery. Recovery of your space, your silence, your essence. You don't have to raise your voice. You just have to stop lowering your worth. The man who wins this battle doesn't become harder. He becomes clearer. He doesn't close his heart. He cleans the room. Because at some point, peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self. There is a loneliness few can describe, and even fewer are willing to admit. Not the loneliness of being alone in a room, but the kind where you're surrounded by people, yet feel completely unseen. Where your presence is expected, but your soul is unnoticed. This is the battle of emotional isolation, and it's one of the most brutal wars a man can fight. You show up, you provide, you sit at the table, answer the questions, do the work, play the role, but deep down, you know the truth. No one is asking how you really are. And if they did, you wouldn't know how to answer anymore. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being someone who could be reached. Not because you didn't want connection, but because connection became unsafe. Your honesty was once used against you. Your softness was met with judgment, so you stopped trying. Emotional isolation doesn't always look tragic. Sometimes it looks responsible. Sometimes it looks strong. The stoic mask becomes a survival tool, but it comes at a cost. Over time, that silence turns to weight, a kind of heavy, invisible armor. And what was once a form of protection becomes a prison you can't see, but feel every day. You become functional, respected even, but not known, not truly. This kind of isolation leaves deeper scars than most forms of visible pain, because it convinces you that your emotions are either irrelevant or too much. You begin to doubt your need for comfort, for understanding, for human warmth. And in that doubt, you slowly detach, not just from others, but from yourself. Marcus Aurelius understood this paradox better than most. As emperor, he lived in constant chaos, noise, expectation, pressure from every side. And yet in the middle of it all, he turned inward, not to escape, but to stay sane. He wrote, not for others, but for himself. His meditations were not public declarations, they were survival maps, quiet reminders that the soul must be seen, even if only by the one who carries it. You're not wrong for craving understanding, but you become free when you stop waiting for it, when you stop explaining your value, when you stop begging to be seen by people who only look through you. That's when you begin to reclaim yourself, not through noise, but through presence. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can offer isn't your words, it's your absence. Not as punishment, but as recalibration. You remove yourself not to create drama, but to restore your peace. You fall quiet not because you've given up, but because you've chosen clarity over noise. The man who wins this battle learns to sit in his own company without shame. He learns to be his own witness, his own refuge, his own mirror, because connection begins inside. And once you feel known there, the loneliness outside begins to lose its grip. There's a pain few men talk about, the pain of being present, but not felt, of providing, but not being remembered, of being a father, and still feeling like a stranger in your child's world. This is the battle of eroded fatherhood, not because you failed, but because you were taught to love through sacrifice, not presence, to give everything, except your actual self. You worked late, you gave up dreams, you stayed through the silence. You did what a man was supposed to do, and yet your name doesn't echo in their hearts the way you hoped. You're known for your effort, but not your essence. You're thanked for your support, but not your soul. And maybe that's what no one told you, that being there isn't the same as being known. Stoicism reframes fatherhood, not as control, not as command, but as anchoring. Zeno taught in the open, his school. The Stoa was public, but it was not chaotic. It had order. It had presence. That's what fatherhood must become, not a lecture, a presence. Something your children can measure, not in words, but in calm, in clarity, in the way the room feels different when you enter it. Being a father isn't just about providing. It's about becoming a stable rhythm in a chaotic world. A silent structure, a space where your child doesn't have to earn your attention, where your attention is the foundation, because children don't remember what you bought them. They remember how you looked at them, how you paused, how you listened when they had no words. They remember how safe they felt being themselves in your shadow. That doesn't mean you must become soft. It means you must become whole, present, grounded. It means showing up not just as a provider, but as a man who knows his own soul. Because fatherhood isn't just inherited. It's built, quietly, consistently, in the small moments where you choose to be there, not just physically, but emotionally. Ask yourself, what ritual have I built that shows my child I exist beyond the paycheck? What moment, every week, reminds them that I'm not just a provider, but a presence? That is where erosion ends, not in grand gestures, but in the daily, sacred decision to be a man they feel, not just a man they see. The man who wins this battle becomes unforgettable, not because he shouted, but because he remained. He became the stillness they could return to when the world turned loud. There comes a moment in a man's life when he realizes some people will never understand him, not because he's too complex, but because they were never listening. They were only waiting for their turn to speak. This is the battle against the need to be understood. It's a quiet war that drains your dignity the longer you fight it. You tried explaining. You tried softening your words, adjusting your tone, choosing the right time. You repeated yourself in different ways, hoping one version would finally be heard. And when that didn't work, you got louder, then quieter, then resentful. But the truth was always the same. They weren't trying to understand. They had already made up their mind about you. Every man faces this temptation, to prove his pain, to justify his heart, to argue for his own worth. But each attempt chips away at something sacred, your inner clarity, the knowing that doesn't need approval to stand tall. The more you explain, the more power you give to those who refuse to receive you. And the more you seek validation from the deaf, the more you question the soundness of your own voice. Epictetus warned us, trying to teach those unwilling to listen isn't wisdom, it's attachment. It's fear wearing the mask of clarity. Because deep down, you don't want them to understand your words. You want them to see your soul, but that's not their responsibility. That's yours. The brain, ironically, finds comfort in repetition, even painful repetition. That's why men stay in loops, trying to get from someone today what they never received years ago. It becomes a cycle of emotional labor that goes unpaid, unseen, unheard. But there's a shift that happens when a man reclaims his silence, not as withdrawal, but as truth, when he replaces, "Why don't they see me?" with, "What am I not seeing clearly in myself?" That's the moment power returns. That's when he stops performing clarity for others and begins living it internally. You don't win this battle by finally being heard. You win by finally not needing to be, by realizing that dignity isn't found in being understood. It's found in understanding yourself so deeply that misunderstanding no longer offends you. You walk away, not in bitterness but in sovereignty, in peace. The man who wins this battle no longer wastes breath on the unwilling. He speaks to those who recognize the weight of silence, and to everyone else, he leaves nothing, not even an explanation. There's a version of you that walks into every room already rehearsed, controlled, measured, projecting confidence even when your chest is burning with fatigue. That version smiles at the right time, speaks just enough, and never lets the cracks show. It's not who you are, it's who you became to survive. This is the battle of performance masculinity, the exhausting act of being who everyone expects, while slowly forgetting who you really are. Most men don't even realize when the performance began. It was subtle, a reward for composure, a nod for keeping it together, a silent agreement that as long as you appear strong, no one will question how you're doing. And you carried that like a badge, until the badge turned into a mask, and the mask turned into a cage. Now every day feels like theater, controlled emotions, calculated words, a version of strength that costs you everything. Sleep, peace, joy. Real masculinity doesn't need an audience. It doesn't perform. It doesn't convince. It exists, quietly, still. Chrysippus of Soli once taught that logic. Without emotional discipline is just noise. The same is true here. Masculinity without presence is just pressure, and presence doesn't come from posing. It comes from essence, from knowing what's real when everything else falls away. But here's the question few dare to ask. What part of your life would collapse if you stopped pretending, if you stopped playing the role? If you let the mask slip, even slightly, what would remain? What relationships would stay? What parts of your day would still feel meaningful? Most men fear the answer, because deep down they sense the truth. They've built lives on expectations, not authenticity, on applause, not alignment. But Stoicism doesn't require performance. It requires presence. It asks nothing from others and everything from yourself. It doesn't ask you to appear wise. It asks you to live wisely. Radical emotional minimalism isn't cold, it's honest. It means stripping away what you're not, reclaiming what you forgot, letting go of the version of yourself that performs strength, and becoming the man who simply is strong, even when no one is watching. The man who wins this battle doesn't stand taller. He breathes deeper, because there's nothing left to prove. No script to follow, no audience to impress, just a quiet truth. He is enough as he is, still, present, whole. There's a kind of discipline that looks admirable from the outside, structured, relentless, focused. But inside, it's something else entirely. It's not devotion, it's desperation. A man who punishes himself every day not because he failed, but because somewhere along the way, he was made to believe he was never enough. This is the battle of shame-driven discipline, and it often hides beneath success. Men rarely admit this, but many of their most disciplined habits come from fear. Fear of mediocrity, fear of judgment, fear of seeing disappointment in the mirror. They grind, they restrict, they control every variable. But it's not peace they're chasing, it's escape. Escape from the voice that says that you should be better by now. Escape from the silence that screams, you were never enough to begin with. Shame is deceptive. It wears the costume of motivation. It floods the mind with urgency. It drives results. But the cost is high, because shame doesn't build identity. It fractures it. It creates a man who is always chasing, always reaching, always punishing, but never arriving. And when he does reach the goal, there is no celebration, only a new standard, a higher wall, a louder voice reminding him, you're still not there. Stoicism doesn't feed that cycle. It breaks it. Zeno's discipline wasn't fueled by shame. It was a reverence for the soul. A man doesn't wake up every day to beat himself into excellence. He rises to honor what already lives in him. Discipline, at its core, is not punishment. It's remembrance. It's a quiet return to who you were before they told you to be more, before you learned to mistake self-loathing for strength. So ask yourself, is your discipline rooted in self-respect or self-rejection? Do your routines reflect who you are becoming or who you're afraid to be? When your alarm goes off in the morning, are you rising with clarity or guilt? You don't win this battle by quitting. You win it by shifting, by moving from self-punishment to self-preservation, from shame to sacredness, from proving your worth to protecting your energy. The shift is subtle, but the result is profound. The man who wins this battle doesn't just become consistent, he becomes whole. He doesn't wake up to correct a flaw, he wakes up to protect his fire, because somewhere deep inside, he no longer asks, "What's broken in me?" Instead, he begins to ask, "What within me needs to be respected today?" Zeno never built a kingdom. He built something more enduring. He built an inner republic, a place inside himself governed not by emotion, not by applause, not by control, but by laws of clarity, presence, and silence. His empire didn't need walls or thrones. It lived inside his discipline. That's where real sovereignty begins, not in domination, but in interior law. And every man watching carries the same responsibility to become the ruler of what he lets live inside him. You are not broken. You are unspoken. Most of what hurts in you has never been given language, not because you didn't try, but because no one taught you how. They taught you how to perform, how to endure, how to provide, but not how to sit in your own soul and ask, "What am I carrying that isn't mine?" The battles you face aren't proof of your failure. They're proof that you haven't given up on yourself. Not completely. Marcus Aurelius didn't write to inspire the world. He wrote to survive himself. His meditations weren't public speeches. They were the last light in a storm, the quiet flame he protected to keep from burning out completely. He was a man with absolute power, and yet, he chose to kneel before his own reflection, to write, to remember, to remain human when everything around him demanded performance. You are that man now. Maybe not an emperor, but a man with noise in every direction, a man asked to carry, to fix, to remain calm while losing everything. And yet, here you are, not because you shouted, not because you fought harder, but because somewhere inside, the fire never died. Picture this, a man walking out of a burning city, not in fear, not in revenge, but in clarity. He doesn't run. He doesn't look back. He simply walks, because for the first time, he realizes he was never meant to live in ruins. Don't rush to win these battles. That's not what this is. This isn't about victory. It's about awareness. It's about the man who recognizes these wars are already being fought in his silence, in his decisions, in the way he gets up each morning, despite the weight, in the way he remains calm when everything else asks him to collapse. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to fix everything. You just need to remember. Stillness is not surrender. It's strength. And some men are loud when they win. Others are just finally quiet.